Okay, it looks like we are live, and I am slowly but surely getting better at actually starting at the time I say I'm going to start at. Anyway, hey y'all, thank you for joining. My name is Michael Salati. I am a developer program engineer at Google. I work on a website called web.dev, and that's actually the website we're going to be doing a little bit of code on today. So let's get a tab open here. Web.dev is kind of like your one-stop shop for uh, learning anything and everything related to web development. So we have content on a slew of different areas, like improving your load times, accessibility, network reliability, building progressive web apps, as well as including information on uh, using frameworks such as React, Angular, and a bunch of information on Lighthouse. And the reason why we have like all this great content is because if you go into the measure section, you can actually drop in a URL of a website that you work on, and we'll run audits on it. So let's just sign in with Google real quick, and I think I have a site that's already been audited lined up, and we can see how that looks. There we go. So just running web.dev through it. There's a lot of areas that we're doing good because I see a lot of green when it comes to accessibility, best practices, SEO, but we fall a little bit short on the performance side of things. But that's fine. I can scroll down, I can see some specific feedback that it's giving me, and here's an example that we can remove some unused CSS. This is having a medium impact on our performance, and so if we click into the remove unused CSS, boom, it takes us straight to an article that exists on web.dev on how we can improve our CSS performance by removing some of that unused CSS. So it's a great resource if you're a web developer. We have articles written by a slew of talented authors, and we don't just have like this prescriptive styled learn section. We also have a blog where we host a lot of cool, interesting new topics that maybe doesn't necessarily fall under a lesson plan, but you still would want to be interested in knowing. So this is the website we're going to be working on, and there's actually one aspect of the website that we're specifically going to be working on, and that is the subscribe thing. So right now, we can see here on the blog section that if I click subscribe, opens up a new tab, and there's a redirect to this form that is where you can sign up for our web dev newsletter. And we send out the web dev newsletter, I believe it's about once a month. However, I'm not the one writing that newsletter, so I believe it goes out about once a month. I'm subscribed to that as well. And we kind of want to be able to improve the experience. One of the main ways that we can improve the experience of this is if you don't end up signing up for the newsletter, let's say for the month of April, and now we're getting close to May. So let's say it's May, you didn't sign up in April, that means you didn't get the newsletter in April. And you as a developer may genuinely be curious as to what we actually posted or shared in April, but there's nowhere to find it unless your friend also subscribed to the email newsletter page here. You have no ability to access what we sent out. So what we want to do is start to host all the newsletters actually on web.dev. And I actually have a sample newsletter that I can pull up. Just give me 1 second. Okay. So this is a sample of what the newsletter ends up looking like. Ends up in the inbox with links to web.dev articles, and it's pretty much just a simple HTML email, but it ends up actually looking really nice in my opinion, and it looks good in your inbox. So let's take a look at what we actually have on web.dev and where we can go from there. So let's actually open up our code base and go from there. So the code base for web.dev is actually publicly available. It's an open source project on GitHub. So if you go to github.com/Google Chrome, and then you'll just want to go to web.dev, and you can pull the repository here. So you can clone it if you want, but I happen to have the project already cloned myself locally. So let's jump into the project. And we're going to check out into master branch because I might have been working on something else. And it says I'm up to date, but I'm just going to pull everything else that I might need. Alright, so that went, and let's check the issues, because there's actually a specific issue that this was tagged in, which I believe was 2725 here. So this is an issue that was open to add an archive of our newsletters to a newsletter route. And that's actually true. We currently host a newsletter route. So if I go to web.dev /newsletter, there's actually a page that exists already that lets you sign up or register for the email list rather than this email list form that we have here. And this is actually a page that I worked on earlier, which I actually think looks nicer than what we see here. But the idea is that we would host all the newsletter content here as well. So let's take a look into how we can do that. All right, where is terminal? Here we go. So we're going to get the project up and running. The start command for local development is npm run dev. I'll make this just a little bit bigger. There we go. There should be more to this build process, so we're just giving it a little bit of time to get going. And I'm just gonna create another tab. Is this in the right folder? No, okay. And we're gonna open up the project in Visual Studio Code so we can work on it there as well. Alright, we can minimize a bunch of this stuff. Okay, so this is where we're going to end up working. Our local project is up and running, so now, instead of doing web.dev on the newsletter, we can do localhost on port 8080, I believe, in newsletter. So here we go, we have this locally. And one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to end up opening up the Chrome DevTools, so I just right-click Inspect. I keep the Chrome DevTools open, one, because it's an easy way to inspect different elements on the page so I can see what I'm actually working with and manipulating as I'm writing some of my code. If I need to log things into the console, I can see some of that into here. And for me, the most important reason why I use this is on the Network tab, I'm going to disable cache while DevTools is open. And that's because this website actually uses a service worker, which kind of caches old assets onto a user's local device. That way, let's say if they want to load web.dev when they don't have an internet connection, the website will still continue to work because a lot of the resources required in order to render or display pages on web.dev have actually been saved onto a user's device. But because I'm actively developing on this website, I don't necessarily want to see old content. I want to see like fresh content changes, even if it's a small change as just changing a button color. I need to know that immediately. So I disable cache and I keep this open pretty much all the time when I'm working on a website with disable cache enabled. All right, so here is our pages, and the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start to we have an example of what a page is going to look like, so we are going to attempt to generate a page on web.dev. And this I actually need to think about because I haven't actually created a page on web.dev before. But I don't think this should be too difficult. So let's get started. So everything that's on web.dev exists inside of our source folder. We're going to go specifically into the site directory, content. We have English content for EN, and we have a section or a folder here called newsletter. And newsletter has this nunchuck partial, which this nunchuck partial is actually importing kind of effectively like another component called subscribe. And subscribe is the actual form that we see over here. So this is everything that exists inside that subscribe area. And there's nothing else to the page other than this two div wrappers, the newsletter landing page wrapper and this layout container wrapper. Otherwise, everything is inside of partial subscribe. And so if I go to our partials, includes partials, subscribe on all of this onto the side. This is the actual content. So we have developer newsletter we see here, developer newsletter we see here. So if I update this developer newsletter with an exclamation mark to make it more exciting and fun, we'll have to wait for the rebuild. So it detected the change to the subscribe file and the page has been rebuilt. So if I give it a refresh, now we have developer newsletter with an exclamation mark, which is exactly what we wanted to see here. I'm just gonna close these for now. We're gonna undo this because we don't need to see that anymore. So we have this page that we host the subscribe form for the newsletter, but we're gonna also use this page to display all of the old newsletters in much the same way that we have, let's say, on web.dev we have our blog section, and here on the blog section, like you have the top header stuff, blog, versus here on newsletter we have developer newsletter, but underneath it we have all these different blog posts and these cards, and we're going to use these same cards for the newsletter section. So we're just going to have cards underneath here displaying old newsletter posts. Okay, so let's minimize this. We're going to work still inside of our content folder, and we're going to work inside of our newsletter. So the directory structure of this, I'm not sure what's the best way to present it, but we're going to start with creating a new folder, and we're going to call this folder 2020. And so we're just going to try to organize the newsletters in a sensible way. So we're going to be using the March 2020 newsletter. I believe that is what this is. Yeah, this is the newsletter example we have, March 2020. So we'll do newsletter year 2020, and then we'll just create a new file, and we'll call it 03 for March. That's going to be a nunchuck file. And I'm going to just copy this information here. It's not that important, but it provides some valuable information, which is pretty much just this meta information that we want, that we are describing the layout, the title of the page, the date that this page was updated, whether we're indexing it, in a description of the page. And so we're going to change this to March 2020 newsletter. Description is stay up to date with the latest about web platform, and that is most everything we need there. The no index we're going to disable. Actually, no, we're going to keep it enabled because no index is probably still the right thing to do. But the date we have set is for March 13th, 2020 for the date created. I'll probably eventually change that, but for the time being, we'll just keep it. I'll probably update it to be the actual date that newsletter went out. So what we should do, though, is actually take a look at the newsletter's HTML page. Okay, so what we see over here, it's newsletter March A HTML, and this is actually the HTML and the CSS for the page that we see here. So I'm just going to take all of this content, copy it, and I am just going to dump it right into here. So underneath these three dash area, which is the meta information for the page, I'm going to just dump the HTML inside of here. And it's a lot. It's not necessarily pretty, but I'm just going to save that. And I believe it should generate a new page. So right now we have our newsletter page. I believe it should create a new page called 2020 /03. And that should display the newsletter page. So we're going to give that a shot. Yeah, okay, so that generated the newsletter page, and to be honest, it's not necessarily the most pretty. And what we have going on here is that the styling for the newsletter has actually been like kind of mixed and matched with the styling that we have on web.dev, so that like I don't know what's the best way to describe it, but either way, it just doesn't look that good. We are gonna leave this for now. I don't. I'm not gonna say that I like the way it looks. I don't. But we are not gonna manipulate the styling. We are actually going to look at displaying the pages in a different way. Uh, Give me 1 second to sip coffee, and we can go from there. Okay. So what I'm going to do first is I am going to actually try to prevent this page from being uh, rendered for the time being, because I don't want to use the HTML as we have it displayed here in order to create the page. We're actually going to create it in a different way. The reason why I'm dumping this newsletter page here is because I want it to be made accessible to me in 11D so that I can manipulate it and use it elsewhere on the site. And that's done through collections, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But let's see how I can tell 11D not to build a page. And so 11D, just so you guys know, is actually the web framework that we use to generate web.dev. It's a static site generator, so everything you see, most everything you see on web.dev is actually rendered in pre-rendered, arguably pre-rendered HTML. So we have static HTML pages that we send down to you. And while we do some JavaScript on the client, that way, like if you're visiting on a website that has JavaScript enabled, like we have web components that make the menu easier to navigate or easier to use if you're on mobiles. Like we have the slide out if you're on mobile, versus if you're on desktop, you have just the top nav bar. Well, that transition for the slide out is something that we write in JavaScript using a custom element. And so that's a JavaScript thing, but the content itself, like the pure content, is all statically generated HTML. And that's what we're going to be working with right now. And so 11D does this for us, but the problem is I don't want to generate this yet. I don't want us to just have a dumped to a page called newsletter 2020-03. So let's take a look at seeing how we can prevent that. So let's go to the docs. Contributors, no. Layout chaining, no. You know what? I just realized there is most likely a better way to address this, but Jekyll said to me. Okay, that was a little funny. There's actually probably a better way to handle this, but this at least works for you guys to see how it would look. Just creating a newsletter page here, and we just dump the HTML and 11D generated out the page. So let's do this in a different way. Okay. Let us go into here in our site. We have something called our data folder. And in data, we have contributors, countries, podcasts, post hosts, a bunch of different stuff. We're going to create a new data file, and we're going to call this data file, new file, newsletter.js. All right. And newsletter.js, I'm actually we're gonna create an object here. So const newsletters. So actually, maybe I should rename this data file to newsletters instead of newsletter, just because we're going to be returning multiple newsletters. There we go. So, and newsletters is going to be an array of objects. So we're going to have an object for each month. So let's give our first one a title. And the first newsletter that we have is for March 2020. So March 2020 newsletter. And next we're going to give it a path. And this is going to tell us where we are actually storing the HTML file for the newsletter. So path is actually going to be relative to where we are. So it's going to be newsletters 2020 03.html. And that is all I'm going to do for the time being. So I'm going to save that, and what I want to do is I want to take that newsletter page that we created. So this 2020 03 NGK. I'm actually going to move this into data, and I'm going to create a new folder inside of here called newsletters. Move 2020 inside of newsletters, and take this 03 NGK file, and we're going to take out that meta information because this is just going to be an HTML file. This isn't going to necessarily be an 11D nunchuck file. I do want to find the title that they use here because if possible, I would like to just use the title that they use. Oh, the title's web.dev. Okay, that's not the great title. So we'll stick with the March 2020 newsletter, but we will rename this into an HTML file. Okay. So now that we have this saved, we can close this. And what we're going to do here is we're actually going to export a function. I want to see how I do this in an object. I want to see how we do this on another page. So a great one is contributors. That we have this great massive contributor object, but at the end of the day, we actually process everything and then we return an output. So I'm actually going to copy this for the time being, though it may not be pretty. Okay, so what we have here is newsletters, and what we can do is we can actually create a new thing called process newsletters. So this is going to be a new object, and it's going to be an array. So I am going to take the original newsletter object and I am going to map it. So this map is a method that is available on arrays that allows us to modify the original object in the array and return all these modified objects as a new array. So it allows us to mutate all the content in newsletters without modifying the actual original newsletters array that we're manipulating. So we're going to be mapping or iterating and modifying every object inside the newsletters array. And so we're going to call that newsletter. And so we're going to be returning a new object. So the title of the new object is going to remain the same title that we had before. And so what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to take the original newsletter object and I'm going to use the spread operator to kind of copy that content into the new object that I'm going to be manipulating. But I'm going to start to modify some of the fields and add new fields. And the first one I'm going to do is, I'm going to create an HTML field. And this is going to be the actual HTML content for the page. And what we're going to do is we're going to use a node lib called fs, I believe that's for file system, and we're going to use that to copy the HTML page as a string. So I believe what that looks like is const fs equals require, just because we're bringing in this external library, require fs, and so the HTML is going to be fs read file sync. So we're going to be reading a file off of the disk and we're going to be reading it not asynchronously but synchronously. That way it's not going to continue unless it reads the file. Read files, or until it reads the file. It will not continue until it reads the file. And we are going to take the path. So right now this path is newsletters 2020 03 HTML. And we see in respects to this newsletters JavaScript file, we have newsletters 2020 03 HTML. So we'll pass path as the first argument of read file sync, but you see if I hover over it, it's currently being returned as a buffer. I want to return the object as a string, so I will also add this additional option, which is going to be the encoding of the string, and we're going to use UTF-8. And if I save that, hold on, save that, I might have to do a quick rebuild. Now what we're going to have is we're going to have this process newsletter is going to look much like newsletters, where it's going to be an array of objects, where the object is going to include the title, a path, as well as the a title and a path, but we're going to actually manipulate that object to also now include an HTML field, which is going to be string, and it's going to be the HTML that's actually shows up. That it's going to be the HTML that we have in the newsletter. So let's export process newsletter, and I'm actually going to make one or two small tweaks to this. Next thing I'm going to do is import, I believe, path. And join. Path and join are used in a few different places. It kind of allows us to abstract some of the way that we write the paths. Not even that. Okay, so let's stick with this. And actually, I need to look at another place where I use this, just because it's going to be really, really useful for me to understand how it works. Give me a second. So once I find an example, I can explain what I'm looking for. Okay, so here's an example of where we create a path. So here we have path join, source, images, authors, key. But I honestly think this is fine. You know what? I don't probably need this. I don't need this. I think this is fine, and I can probably do away with that. So it's just newsletters 2020 03 HTML. I think that'll work. So let's save that. Let's rebuild this. And in a second, I am breaking stuff. Okay, what am I breaking here? Type path must be a string. Oh, yeah. It's getting confused with that path. And so this was a mistake I made, not taking into account the path is a field of newsletter. So let's just give that a quick fix. Newsletter.path. That should be good. This can go. So here we go. So now it's just an array of newsletters, which is the title, the path, which is the path that's required to read the newsletter. So here it's newsletters 2020 03 HTML, and relative to this newsletters file, we have newsletters 2020 03 HTML. Let's run that. Okay, there still seems to be an issue here. And what is that issue? No such file or directory. Newsletters 2020 03 HTML. That is odd because I am pretty sure I spelled that correctly. Newsletters. Yeah, no, I think I spelled that correctly. So this is a different issue. And it may be... It may be how I am actually writing the path. So let's modify this. And I think if, let's say, hypothetically, I was just to add a period to the end of it, it would work. So let's see if that's a trick. No. Okay. this has become more interesting. And troubling. So I was under the impression just adding that path would put it relative to where I am. But I don't think that's the case. Or adding the period would make it relative to where I was, but I don't think that's the case here. But I think like the path is technically correct, but from where I am reading the path is the issue. So like where I'm starting the script is inside of the like the root folder, the root of this folder. So it's newsletters 2020 HTML doesn't necessarily exist. It's like kind of embedded inside of source site data, right? So we need to get this file a different way. But this is odd. Okay, so we need to know what folder we're actually inside of, and I think that's with like I think Node provides something like directory name or dir name. All right. Dir name. Okay, so the directory name of the current module is the same as path.dir name of the file name. So here's an example. So this should say as to where we are currently. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to do a console log here, and I know that this code is going to break, but this is just a sanity check to make sure that I have the right stuff going on. So I'm going to console log dir name, and hopefully it should give the path of where I am. Okay, so dropping dir name in here gave the path of like where in my code this newsletter is being executed. But I think the issue that I have, I want to believe I spelled newsletters correctly. Newsletters. I'm looking back and forth at them to make sure I'm not crazy. Yeah, I think I spelled that the same. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to use this dir in order to help us better like see or to better map out the URL of the or the path of this HTML file. So what we'll do here is we'll do path dot, and we're going to use this method called join, which here direction it takes in a slew of strings, right? You can pass in as many arguments as you want, and what it'll end up doing is going to join all the strings together and normalize it into a path or a directory that we can use. So take that, pass in the dir name, and so this should actually hopefully work if my sanity is a thing. So we're going to read a file. The first argument for the file is going to be the path we're going to grab it from. The second argument is our encoding. So the path is going to be a join of the current directory that we are working in, as well as the path field of the newsletter object, which is newsletters 2020-03 HTML. All right. Hopefully that should not crash. Okay, that is starting to look better. Okay, so that works, and so now I, in 11D, I have a data object, which includes this, and that's what we're going to be working with in order to make this newsletter section work. I don't know if I want to keep it as a data object or if I want to move it into a collection, but for the time being, we'll keep it as a data object because it doesn't really need access to anything else in 11D. So let's go into our newsletter section, and I'm actually going to copy, going to minimize, or get rid of all this stuff. Actually, before we go into the newsletter section, now that we have it as a data object we can manipulate, I want to actively go to build out this the newsletter page. And so I want to do this in a dynamic way because right now all the newsletters are going to be stored in this data object, where I would love it if I can just take this data object, iterate over it, and render out every page rather than having to manually create a page in this newsletter folder. And because I have that as a data object that I can iterate over to generate pages, I could also iterate over the object to generate the card previews on the index of the newsletter. The index of the newsletter being this page. So we'll have cards down here, but first let's get to making this path a valid URL. Okay, let's see. A great example of where we do this is, I'd say, our authors page. So I'm gonna take authors, and we have a variable called individual. And I'm gonna, or a file, a nunchuck file called individual. I'm gonna copy that. I'm gonna just dump it into the newsletter because it's kind of easier to reuse some code. Paste. And so we're gonna rename some of these things. So the first thing, layout, is gonna stay the same, but title, we're gonna change it to newsletter. The permalink, which is gonna be the URL that we're gonna use, we're gonna modify that in a little bit. So we'll leave that right now. The thing that we really want to manipulate or change, though, is this pagination field. So the way pagination works in 11D, and this is a thing that I've covered before in a previous video, is effectively it'll allow us to iterate over an array or chunk an array. So pretty much it takes an array and will return to you X or N amount of objects in the array at a time. So let's say if I have an array of 20 objects, which the array that I want to use, I pass into the data field of paginations. So here it's taken paginated by authors, but let's say if I did data.newsletters, and let's say I had like 100 newsletters, I could iterate over newsletters one at a time. So each time that this individual newsletter template gets rendered out, it would render one at a time. So each time I render it, I'd only have access to one object. I could do it size 20 at a time. That way, each time I iterate over it, I'll have 20 objects, and so on and so on. But in this case, I just want to iterate it over one at a time because I want to create one page per newsletter, rather than like 20 pages per newsletter. So we have data, newsletters, and the alias for this is going to be newsletter. And what it ends up looking like if you're a JavaScript developer, and maybe if you've written like React or like a Polymer element, what it's going to kind of end up looking like is data newsletters dot map, where each item is going to be one newsletter just because we chose the pagination size to be 1. And then what we're going to return is, if I spell return correctly, it's just some HTML. And whatever we have in the HTML is actually whatever content exists down here. And so this pagination area ends up actually behaving something similar to this. All right, so now what we should be able to do is use that newsletter alias, which is just the individual object that we have from the iteration, and just dump the href off of it. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to not the href, the HTML. And final thing I'm going to do here is actually use the HTML that I want. So this also comes from the newsletter object, and we'll use path. So we'll save that. I'm gonna kill the server and rebuild, and we'll see what that looks like. Actually, I should change the title to be respective to the newsletter object, not paged that we had before. Errors. Cannot resolve pagination key in template data newsletters. Okay. That probably makes sense. So it's pretty much saying that data newsletters, I am under the impression this is pretty much saying that data newsletters doesn't exist. And while the file may have been created, it might not be readily seeable by 11D. So let's check this file called 11D.js. And I haven't actually done that much with the data file, so I'm curious if data files get imported here, but it doesn't look like data files get imported here. It looks like we have filters, we have collections, and we have components. So this is a place where it looks like instead of working with the data object, I think it may make more sense to work with the collections. So let's create a new collection, and I'm actually just gonna okay, let's create a new collection here. New file, and we will call this newsletters.js. All right, and so in newsletters.js, I'm actually going to copy some of the code that we have in author, which is a collection that we have. It'll just make this a little bit easier, but there's a little bit less work we need to do here. So file system we won't need, path we won't need, live posts and set default we won't need. The only thing we're going to need is the actual newsletters, and that's going to come from data, our data folder, newsletters file. Returns an array of all newsletters. And that array ends up looking like objects of titles that are going to be strings, path, which is also going to be a string, and finally HTML, which is also a string. Posts, we don't really need a parameter here because we're just going to be returning this newsletters object here. So let's dump or get rid of a lot of this stuff. The only thing I want to keep here is this modules export. Remove the parameter because we won't be using the parameter, and we're gonna just return newsletters. So this will return the array. So now we have a collection of newsletters that is available, and so we can use collection newsletters here instead of data newsletters. Collection newsletters, and the last thing I need to do is I actually need to make it available to 11D across the application. So I am going to go into this 11D.js file, and I am going to create a new collection. So I'm just going to copy this one to keep it simple. Alright, so the path for that is newsletters, and we're going to call the collection newsletters. Save that, and then scroll down to where we actually define the collections in our 11D configuration. And so we're going to add a collection called newsletters, and we're going to be passing in that newsletters function that we created over here. So module export, it's a function that will return our newsletters. That is fine. And so we define that inside of 11D. So now 11D has access to this collection called newsletters, which is the newsletters that we have here. So if I run this again, ideally what should happen is that 11D will, this template thing should just work, where it'll go over the collection called newsletters, it'll do one at a time, and didn't. Cannot resolve pagination key in template collection newsletters. Interesting. Okay. I am not sure what I am breaking here. But we should take a look at what actually got generated. So I'm going to go into the dist folder. I'm going to go to the English section. I'm going to go to newsletters and see if anything got generated correctly or if I am losing it. Both of which are possible. Okay, nothing is generated here because we go from native to network next, but no newsletter. Could not resolve pagination key in template data collection newsletters. This just returns newsletters, which is an array with HTML title path. Okay. This is just returning the objects that we manipulate. Alright. Cannot resolve pagination key in template. Let's check the 11D pagination documentation, because maybe I'm just doing something wrong with 11D. I thought I knew what I was doing with 11D. I very well could not be knowing what I'm doing, and I think I realized what I'm doing wrong, but let's just check the docs to make sure. And so this is available on 11d.dev. That's like 11ty, like the character 11ty.dev. Pagination, paging an array. Okay. So to iterate over a data set and create pages for individual chunks of data, use pagination. Enabling your template front matter, adding the pagination key, consider the following template. So this is kind of what I mentioned before, that it's iterating over test data where it's returning 2 items at a time. But I think it is returning an array. I think it's returning an array rather than the actual object. Because let's say if I hypothetically set the pagination to be, let's say, like 3 elements at a time, I need a way to definitively declare that I'm manipulating 3 objects at a time. So I think the issue here is newsletter is an array, so there's no path on newsletter. This is speculation. But I want the first element in newsletter, which is the actual object I want. So let's save that. Kill the server, rebuild, and let's see if that works more as expected. Resolve pagination key in template data collection newsletters. Okay, that did not resolve it. So what am I actually doing wrong here? This is, well, not exciting. I'm just gonna console log this newsletter object to see what I'm actually manipulating and working with. That's the HTML. Close of the object, close of the array. So yeah, it's an array of objects, but it doesn't necessarily understand the array of objects. Okay. Pagination items 0. Resolve values. That's if I'm working with an object. I'm not working with an object. I'm working with an actual array, though. Pagination items. Okay, let's see if I was to simplify this. It is collection. It is newsletters, I believe, unless I'm misspelling something. Just undoing to make sure that I collections collections, not collection. And that makes sense. Okay. So save that to collections. Let that build. And hopefully that's it. Found duplicate post URL English. So is newsletter path not being understood properly? That's a possibility. I'm pretty sure newsletter path is... Alright, let's... I think, and I'm curious if because I have the / here in the path, that it is misunderstanding this to be here, and I'll just paste what that looks like. If it's misunderstanding the path to look like this, which would be a little bit funky for a path, so I'm going to remove that / there. Okay, that is not an error. That is possibly a good sign. I'm going to check the dist folder to see what gets built. I'm going to... Is it? No? No, path is valid. Alright, I need to consider how I'm actually going to better structure this. And so I'm going to make some changes to what path actually looks like. So I'm just going to set path equal to newsletter 2020. All right, let's change things up on how we generate the path. So we're going to create a year. Year is going to be 2020. Month is going to be 03 for March. The reason why I am restructuring this is because instead of using the path field, I'm going to attempt to use a different field. So now the directory should now be newsletter year, and then the second argument is going to be the actual HTML file. So that's going to be newsletter.month.html. Okay, so this is going to be the new way that we get the HTML, and how we're going to read that HTML. So we're going to generate a path from the directory name, the newsletter year, the newsletter month, and finally the we're just going to add the HTML prefix at the end of it. I'm going to change this to a number instead of actually, I'm going to keep it as a string. And one thing we're going to also do here is we're going to create an href field, an href or a permalink field, and that's going to declare where the actual where we want this newsletter specifically to exist on the website. So here I should be able to do newsletters. Newsletters should go in here as well. Year, month, index HTML. Okay, so now we're taking the newsletter object that we had before, so title, year, and month stay there. We're adding a permalink field, which is going to be, we're going to join newsletters with the year, with the month. And actually, instead of newsletters, I'm going to just change it to newsletter, because it's going to live inside newsletter section. So change that to newsletter, year, month, index HTML. And the HTML for the file is going to be the current directory plus newsletters plus newsletter year, and then newsletter month HTML. Let's save that there. And just so I can see what newsletter looks like, I'm going to do a console log specifically of the permalink, because I want to make sure I link to this correctly. So newsletter 0.permalink. Save that. kill, start. Alright, so that's newsletter 2020 index HTML, which is along the lines of what we want to see. So we will change this from newsletter 0 path to newsletter 0 permalink. Save that. Let that rebuild, and let's see if the page actually shows up the way we would like it to show up. Illegal operation on a directory dist English. Legal operation. So what is this illegal operation I am doing here? Alright, let's add English, that backslash or forward slash, because I realize we're not really returning a forward slash now. And duplicate post URL English. Okay, so this is becoming a more interesting issue for me. Sure, let's just do permalink is newsletter, newsletter year, newsletter month. Save that, and then into the individual newsletter, we'll add a forward slash index HTML. And I'm wondering if this just has to do with how the newsletter URL is being generated. So let's kill the, or how 11D is interpreting the permalink, because we're computing it with dynamic data and static content. So this could just be an oddity that I'm not aware of. No. Found duplicate post URL English. So this is weird because we're giving it an actual path. This is actually going to bother me, so I'm going to throw a random string in here as a safety to see what is actually being generated here, because this is really, really odd for me, because I am fairly confident that this newsletter object actually exists and makes sense, but it doesn't seem, according to 11D, it doesn't. So let's go to English. Now there's a really random folder, this lskafj, that should be generated. And it goes straight to index. So this newsletter permalink stuff didn't get rendered out at all. In fact, nothing inside of here actually did it. Nothing got inside of the content. Okay, so I was under the impression that this collection newsletters should have rendered correctly, but it doesn't look like it actually did, and I am not sure why, because I am confident that collection newsletters exists. I am confident that newsletter is the alias that I'm using. Yeah, that's where I'm using in different places. But I don't know why whatever is in the 0 index isn't actually being used. And this is going to actively eat at me. Alright, so should have rebuilt. I'm just opening up the rendered HTML to see if there's anything that I can see. Object. Cool. Alright, so the newsletter, I wonder if 11D has a simple way of interpreting a object. Okay. Let's just search the docs to see if we can stringify something. Stringify. Okay. Let's dump the 0 because maybe I am mistaken in a way I did not expect. Let's save that. That throws an issue. Expected symbol, got variable, end. Alright, that hasn't thrown in. Okay. This is not what I expected, but it seems like it's returning the. Possibly that it's returning the object, not a chunk of objects. So newsletter is correct. So now there's this newsletter 2020-03 index HTML. Okay, so this is a weird issue, and I'm not sure exactly what to pin it on, but I think I confused myself in a few places. I think first I confused myself by not referencing the right collection, or the right object. I was doing collection. So first I was doing collection newsletters, and it ended up throwing out a little issue. So I thought, oh, maybe it's because newsletter is being chunked, like it's an array instead of an individual object, that I started doing this. And I think I kept this here thinking that was the right thing, but once I realized that collection should be collections, I kept newsletter index 0, and that was not the way to go. And I felt like I was doing something wrong. I wasn't sure what it was. But this is what the syntax should look like. And so what's going on, just to iterate like what this should actually be, is that we're going into this newsletters collection, which is an array of objects. We're going to iterate over the array of objects one object at a time, and we're going to use that one object to generate this template. So the size is set to 1. Now, the individual object, we're going to alias it newsletter. So instead of having to do like collections newsletter 0, collections newsletter 1, I just do newsletter, and I have the one object at a time. The path for it is going to be this en for English and index HTML static, but the permalink are this middle part comes from the newsletter object, as well as the title, as well as the HTML that we are going to render here. So let's save that. And now what we should be able to do is go to web.dev newsletter 2020-03, give that a refresh. And now we have the page here. So we see March 2020 newsletter, and this doesn't necessarily look the nicest or cleanest, and that's because the HTML is being interpreted as just a string rather than HTML. So we're gonna make a quick tweak to edit that. And I think this is something I do in authors, where we actively look to process things as HTML. So there's a pipe called safe, which I think instead of rendering out whatever this HTML field is as a pure string, this safe will allow us to interpret it as actual HTML, I believe. So let's see. It is not. Okay. Let's see the 11D pipes to see what we can do. Pipes are filters to see how we can actually do this. So I'll just do HTML. Lambda is simple sign. You know what? I wonder if there is a pipe just called HTML that will interpret this string as HTML content that can be rendered. Error filter not found. You know what? This is fine. I say that. I know that's usually a bad sign immediately when I say this is fine. I think of the meme with the oh god, what is it? The dog living in a world of fire. Um, I do want to dig into why this isn't actually rendering correctly, but at the end of the day, this isn't necessarily the biggest issue, because if you remember earlier in the stream that we ended up having a little bit of a conflict between the HTML that we were displaying, or the CSS that was attributed to the newsletter, and the CSS that was attributed to the rest of the website. So we can leave this as here, and the reason for that is I was actually going to use an iframe to embed the HTML. The reason why I wanted to use an iframe is that it would kind of encapsulate the styling for the newsletter. That way you wouldn't necessarily we wouldn't have a conflict with anything else. Now, typically iframes are used to embed web pages inside of other web pages. So, this is actually a great example here in W3 Schools, that here is an iframe that is displaying another page on W3 Schools, and you can see this like source sample of the code. The element is iframe, and the attribute source is whatever URL you want to put into it. But we can actually do this without necessarily having to point to another URL. We can do this by actually using by passing in HTML as an argument. So on the MDN Docs Mozilla Developer Network, I think we can check all the attributes of the iframe element, and the attribute we want specifically is source doc. So this allows us to embed HTML as an attribute. Take a string of HTML and embed it as an attribute, and this will render that out. And so what that'll end up looking like, and I'm just going to copy this here. So we can do iframe source doc. I'm going to comment that out for now. And so pretty much I can put in any HTML here. So I'll do div hello world. Closing div, save that. Let this rebuild. And so now I'm going to have an iframe that exists on the page that will just display this HTML, rather than actually having to make an additional network request for a different URL to render. So if I go back into the March 2020 newsletter, refresh. So here now is the iframe with hello world. So again, let's inspect this as able to use an iframe without having to actually make a request for a new page. And that's what I want to do with this newsletter stuff. I want to be able to render the HTML that the newsletter has and the CSS that the newsletter has by default without having to affect the CSS. And by using source doc, I'm able to encapsulate that styling inside of the using the iframe. I can encapsulate the styling, and using source doc, I just pass in the HTML rather than having to pass in a URL that I'm hosting it at. So let's take this newsletter HTML string that we have, and let's replace our source doc with newsletter HTML and save that. And so while what the generated content for that is going to look like really ugly, because all of the HTML is going to exist inside the source doc attribute. And let's see if I can find that real quick. So in the dist folder, we have our newsletter section. I passed the ends, didn't I? Newsletter 2020 index HTML. So I should have an iframe. Okay, so while I have the iframe here, so this looks really, really ugly because I embedded all the HTML inside of the iframe. This way I'm able to display the content of the newsletter without actually having the CSS of the website affect the CSS of the newsletter. So let's go back, give this page a refresh. And now, wow, while it's very small, we have the newsletter here that's completely unaffected by like anything related to uh, the styling that we have on web.dev. But this can be made to look a little bit better. So let us do that. All right, so we're gonna do a little bit of styling, and the first thing I want to do is I'm gonna tinker. Actually, you guys probably can't see that too well. I'm gonna tinker with this element here. So we have, oh no, that's the actual individual image. I want to tinker with the iframe. All right, and so let us see what iframes are capable of. So I can set the width of it, and I can probably set the height of it, but let's see. Yeah, height is default height. Set true, can activate full screen. Allow full screen. I don't think I need allow full screen, but let's get rid of that. Let's tinker with this. Let's say that the width is, no, auto doesn't do anything. What if the width is 100%? Okay, now that the width is 100%, it ends up taking up the full page, the full width of the page. And let's say height is WebKit fill available. That ends up looking okay. 100% doesn't necessarily do it. I think fill available ends up looking right, but I don't believe WebKit fill available is going to work everywhere. So let's just do a Google search to see if there's a way that we can have this iframe actually take up the full page without us having anything to worry about. Iframe size full. Iframe full size of content. Cool. Make iframe automatically adjust height according to, and this is probably what we want. Make iframe automatically adjust height according to the contents without using scroll bar. So they seem to do it with a bit of, this seems to be done with JavaScript, which isn't necessarily wrong. It's actually a really simple, great solution, but I don't know if it's going to necessarily help. But they do have a different source. Okay, yeah, it looks like this is something that will have to be addressed probably with JavaScript. Okay. One thing I'm going to do though is I'm just going to actually steal this little frame border 0 and scrolling to equal no. And the reason for that is right now we have this scroll wheel that's inside of the iframe. And then outside of it we have another scroll wheel, which is for the rest of the page. So let's dump that in there and let's set, yeah, I'm just hard coding it for now. Is it the best solution? No, but I'm going to just hard code the CSS for the time being too. And then we'll eventually move this out. Another thing I can do is probably stop console logging that permalink. That's fine, but hopefully this got rebuilt, so let's give this a refresh. Okay, so here we have our iframe. It is unscrollable, which is expected since we set scrolling to no. But the only problem that we have here is the height, where we want it to take up the full size available. No. Interesting. Okay. Let's change scrolling to yes. Okay, so it only takes the full height of the rest of the available page. There's still scrolling inside of it that has to happen. All right, it looks like this CSS is the way to go. But let me just set this to 100 view height. And I guess that's what we're gonna have to do for the time being. I wonder, yeah, all right, we'll set the height to 100 view height for now. And it looks like we're gonna have to do, some specific JavaScript for the iframe. All right, so we're gonna have to do JavaScript in order to dynamically resize the height of the iframe in order to display the iframe in its full height. That way, when a user is scrolling through the page, they don't have this like double scroll aspect because the iframe doesn't need to scroll. It already has the full size required. Because right now, if we hover over the iframe, we can see that it has a height of, I believe, oh my god, I'm reading this wrong, aren't I? So width height or height width? I believe it's height width. So it has a height of 1,100 pixels, though the content inside of it is actually more than 1,100 pixels. Okay, so let us. All right, so we're gonna create a wrapper for the iframe that's gonna allow us to dynamically adjust the height of the iframe on the fly. And in order to do this, we're actually going to use a custom element that will handle this for us. So we have in our source folder the lib folder where we host these components, and we're going to create a component for the for a newsletter article. So I am actually going to copy one of these. I'm just going to repurpose it because that's probably going to be a little bit easier. So I'm going to take this copy code element that we have, copy, paste, and unfortunately I'm going to set scrolling to yes for the time being, because the user will need to be able to scroll if we are unable to dynamically adjust the height of the page, or the iframe, and we won't be able to dynamically adjust the height of the iframe if JavaScript is disabled. So the default is going to be scrolling yes, but we will end up manipulating this later. So save that for now. Copy code, we're going to rename to newsletter. And let's get into the actual styling of this. So the styling for the time being, any sass isn't necessarily needed, but we are going to rename the class name to newsletter, and the custom element, the way we're going to define it is web newsletter. Okay, so all right, so we are going to, let's see what they do here and what the solution recommended is. Connected should be on the, okay. We're actually going to put this back, and what we're going to do is in the constructor, we're going to create a thing called this iframe. This is going to be a variable inside of the custom element, and so we're going to do this dot query selector. We're going to grab the iframe that's going to be embedded inside of it. Okay, so this is going to grab that iframe element, and from there we can actually start to manipulate it. So if this ends up executing, we can set this iframe scroll is going to be set to false. So the reason why we're setting scroll to false inside of here is if this element is connected and runs, then JavaScript is enabled. And then if JavaScript is enabled, we can dynamically edit the height of the iframe rather than it being dependent on some dynamically assigned height or statically assigned height for the iframe. So this is pretty much saying, okay, we can dynamically update this, so we will dynamically update this. But I'm going to actually do this in the connected callback. Okay, so when the custom element is connected, then we're going to start manipulating stuff in rather than in the constructor. All right. So we'll just save this for the time being, and let's get this custom element defined where it needs to be defined. So in app.js, this is our custom elements, component, profile switcher, search, copy code. I'm just gonna dump the newsletter here for the time being. Okay. So now in our code, now in our HTML, we should have access to a element called web newsletter. If JavaScript is enabled, web newsletter will work. If JavaScript is not enabled, web newsletter won't do anything. But if JavaScript is enabled, when newsletter is attached to the DOM, it's going to query inside of it for a child node, which is going to be an iframe, and it's going to set the iframe scroll property to false. So what we end up seeing in our site web newsletter. So what we'll see is, though we have the iframe scrolling set to yes, the custom element is actually going to, once it's connected to the DOM, it's going to take that attribute scrolling yes, and we're going to have it change to scrolling no. So I realize I did write that incorrectly, but we're going to modify that in a second. So component, newsletter, query selector, scrolling, and that's going to be assigned to no. Let's go back and give that a refresh and see what happens. So right now, scrolling is set to yes on the iframe. And you can see the only thing wrapping the iframe is div with an ID of content, but scrolling works. Let's give this a refresh. Now, if I go inside of the page, I see div ID content, there's web newsletter, and now if I look at the iframe, scrolling is set to no. So as I scroll down, I don't actually scroll inside of iframe, which is the intended effect for the time being. Let's continue on this, because right now, though we are able to dynamically set scrolling to no, we want to dynamically adjust the height of the iframe. That way, we can set the height of the iframe to be based on the content inside of it. So let us make a few more modifications here. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change the width and the height rather than being properties of, or part of the style. I'm just going to set that as properties of the iframe. And the reason why I'm doing this is that way when I want to manipulate the height and the width of the iframe, I can just do iframe.height and modify that. So let's save that and let that build again. Okay, give that a refresh. All right, so now iframe, give that another refresh. All right, so the width is actually set to 100%, but the height of 100 view height isn't actually understood. So I'll just change that to like 1,000 pixels for now, just because pixels will be understood. But we're going to dynamically adjust that height with our newsletter custom element. And so I'm going to go back to the Stack Overflow response to get an idea of the best way to handle this. So this was answered in a different thing. So just width and height. Okay, so this is what they do. DOM content load. Get element by ID iframe. And this is the function that they call. So they set the iframe width to the scroll width, and then they set the iframe height to this. So what I really want is two things. What I really want is just this bit of code, and I'll explain what's going on here. So we're going to set this dot iframe, and we're going to set the height property, height, and we're going to set that to this dot iframe dot, and we're going to so okay, content window, document body, scroll height. So content window is going to give us the actual access to manipulate the content of the iframe. Window, document body height. Okay, document body is going to be the content, and then scroll height is going to be the height of the scroll up and down. So if I save that, so what's going to happen here is that this web newsletter element that we're wrapping, it's going to grab the iframe property inside of it. It's going to set scrolling to no, so it's going to disable scrolling on the iframe, and we're going to quickly set the height to be the height of the scroll height of the actual content inside of the iframe. So let's go back to the March 2020 newsletter, give this a refresh. And so now iframe is iframe scrolling is set to no, height is set to 2096. So as I scroll down, content scrolls, content scrolls, content scrolls, we get to the end of the page. And that iframe doesn't have any inner scroll, but the height of it is perfectly set. And let's adjust. So here's the little issue that we're having that I'm going to address real quickly, is that as the window resizes, the content inside of the iframe is going to also adjust, because the content inside of it is going to end up getting smushed. So what I want to do is I want to create a listener for when the window or when the element resizes to also readjust the height of the iframe. So let's do this real quick. Let's create a function called set height. And so that way, instead of just calling or running this code again, I can just call a function. So if I adjust it once here, it'll apply everywhere. And here we're going to do this dot, and we're going to set an event listener, add event listener. And the event listener is going to be on a resize, just because on resize of the page, we want to adjust the width of, or the height of the iframe if needed. All right, so on resize, we'll execute this function, and this function is going to be this dot set height. There we go. So now we have an event listener on the newsletter element, this web newsletter. So if the size of it adjusts, then we will quickly update the height of the iframe, and this should be sufficient, because if the width of the newsletter adjusts, then the width of the iframe is going to adjust. So let's save that. That should rebuild hopefully fairly fast. Okay, let's give this page a refresh. Give it another refresh. Interesting. No, something didn't work as expected. So yeah, okay, I see why not. So this iframe is set to 1000 pixels. Scrolling is set to no, and if I resize the width of it, oh, web newsletter is not going to adjust. Okay, we're going to add a listener to the document. This document add event listener. And another thing we're going to do is this only waits to set the height on a resize. We want it to set the height from the very get-go. So now we're going to set the height as soon as the element gets loaded, and then on resize we're going to reassign the height. think that is what we want to see. So let's give this a refresh. And so now the height is the appropriate height, but and if I resize it, hold on. Okay, that resize isn't quite working correctly, but I think what's bothering me more is that the inner content inside of the iframe isn't adjusting, but I think this might be outside of our control. I think this has to do more with the newsletter, how it's the width of the content is assigned inside of it, only because the iframe is taking up as much of the page as possible. So that's not really on us. But if we check the height here, it's set to 2065. Let's squish it. Still set to 2065. So let's adjust this from this document to document because that is a mistake I made. We want it to affect like when the entire, window add event listener resize. Okay, so when the window resizes, that should take care of that. Give that a refresh. Okay. This looks better. The height is now set to 3,329 pixels. As I scroll, it goes smoothly from the content of the iframe into whatever is underneath it, which is our footer. If I go to resize it, the height did not trigger. Okay, so that resize event did not, either it triggered or it did not execute what I expected it to execute. Alright, let's do a console log to see if this is being executed, because it's a very well, or we can do debugger. And so what debugger will do, it will it'll freeze the code from executing when it hits this line, and so we can actually see when it hits in real time, rather than waiting on the console log, because we can lose track of what's happening with console log. So generated 10 files. Give this a refresh. So on first load, okay, debugger got hit. If I check the element, I can see that the iframe height is still set to 1,000 pixels. Scrolling is set to no. But if I check, where is my debugger bit? Okay, so set height is being called for the first time, and that's going to adjust the height here. So let's resume script execution. All right, that is set, that is set, that is set. But if I resize it, set height isn't triggered again. So this window add event listener is not actually triggering, and that's very well possibly because window add event listener isn't an actual bit of code. So maybe I can add an event listener to see if the iframe resizes. Because if the iframe resizes, then its width might be changing. So let's find that iframe. Okay, and we'll add an event listener. Add event listener. It's going to be resize. Console log. Resize. Okay, so let's see if that iframe resizes. So this resize event listener is not being actually triggered in the way that I expected it. And maybe that has very much to do with an issue of how I'm writing it. So let's see if there is a different way. Let's just do a Google search. See if element changes width. JavaScript. How to detect div dimension changes. This could point us in the direction that we need to use. For example, there's a div which has a 100% width. It contains some elements, blah, blah, blah. No. So there's resize. There's this thing called resize observer. Is resize observer actually used anywhere else? Because if it is, it might be of interest. Resize observer. Interface reports changes to the dimensions of an element's content or border box or the bounding of an SVG element. Okay. So this might be along the lines of what I want to use. What is it compatible with? It is not at all compatible with Safari, which could be problematic. But it works on Chrome, Edge, Firefox, Opera. Alright, so it looks like I should be able to do document on resize, shouldn't I? Like, I don't need to necessarily see if the element changes. I should be able to see if the document changes. Was I not doing document resize? No, I'm doing window resize. All right, let's try document document on resize. Okay, let's try this. Document on resize, which is going to be the event listener, and it's going to run this dot set height. Save that. So rather than if the iframe resizes, because it shouldn't, we'll just see if the document resizes. We'll execute this code. All right, let's go back to the newsletter, give it a refresh. All right, so pause the first time, and this is probably the initial load. It probably paused the first time because of the initial load, right? Because if I check it, the element, the height's probably fixed to 1,000 pixels still. All right, let's continue run. And now, and the height is appropriate. And if I give it a resize, nothing. Cool. All right, let's try the resize observer for the time being. And this might end up just being the best thing that we can use for now. I'm gonna copy this code here. Gonna dump it here for the time being. And so we're gonna do here this, and I'm gonna stick with RO because that works for resize observer. And what I want to do, this resize observer, is if the resize observer, what's the arguments for resize observer? Resize observer. So I believe I think the first argument is the resize observer is going to take an argument of the function that it's going to execute. All right, constructor, this dot set height, and we're going to bind this just because I'm not 100% sure how this is going to work. Okay, so the resize observer is going to take the argument this dot set height, and then it's going to observe this dot observe. It's going to observe the iframe. So ideally what we have here is we're creating a resize observer that's going to execute this set height function, and we're going to observe the iframe to see if the iframe resizes. Then we're going to execute this function, and we're going to create a disconnected callback to remove the resize observer. This dot ro dot unobserve, I believe. Unobserve. Okay. Unobserve this dot iframe. Let's save that. Okay, so ideally now we should have a resize observer that's going to exist on side of the that's going to be watching the iframe, and whenever the iframe resizes, we are going to call the set height function, which is going to resize the iframe based on the new height. Give it a refresh. All right, first time that got called set height, that's going to adjust the height. Continue. So this looks good. That is wrong. That should get removed. Okay. Save that. Let's try that again in a sec. Okay, there we go. So set height gets executed. Continue. I saw that executed twice, so I'm wondering if the resize observer triggers the first time as well. But if I adjust the element, oh, that is weird. Huh. That is very, very weird. I think it's hijacking the resize event, so nothing else is triggering. Interesting. Okay. Not quite the path I wanted to go, because I think I actually have to continue stuff. Element resize event. On resize events. On resize events. Body on resize. Okay. Object on resize, add event listener resize. So I can apply it to body, but not maybe anything else. All right. Document dot body on resize. Remove this. Comment that out for the time being. Let that run. I don't do resize stuff that often, so this is like kind of outside of my wheelhouse. So very real possibility I am messing something up hard here. Actually, I've been messing something up hard here. Alright, code triggers the first time. Press play. This is fine. Why is this throwing an error? Document body on resize is not a function. Document body on resize, I'm pretty sure. Is not a function. Why is this the case? I'm writing a website with a canvas. Oh, it is an equal, not. It's a property that I need to assign. Maybe. Yeah, it's a property. Okay. Weird. Save that. My bad. Possibly. And if not, I'll do this as an event listener rather than an assigning a function here. Okay, first time execute, that's fine. No red lines there. So if I scroll, this looks good. Resize. Well, problematic. Add event listener. Okay. I'm wondering if I'm like hijacking these events. That's part of the problem. I need to give it what event to listen to. Resize. Save that. document body add event listener type resize. Depends on event listener for the event. Alright, let's give this a shot. First time that runs, that's fine. Press play. Resize the body. Nothing. So document body resize is not triggering. Document body resize. Window size logger. Document query selector, right? Report window size. Window add event listener. So they apply to the window, but that doesn't necessarily work for me. So this is a weirdness that I am dealing with, and there's a very real possibility that I don't think I'm going to be able to get this done in the time I have available today, because unfortunately I have to end the stream in like a couple of minutes. But I'm just going to try it with the window add event listener, which I think I've already done, but just for the sake of checking, I'm not sure exactly what's going wrong here, and I might have to run this by some coworkers to figure it out. So play, this is fine. Resize the window. No, but it ends up breaking whatever I have going on here. So if I just comment that out for the time being, give that a refresh, that initial height works fine. And if I resize, like, no, I'm still having some issues with the resize. But I will say this is a decent first step. I think I'm definitely going to need to adjust this because while I got the height thing down, I'm definitely having issues with the taking care of the height on the resize. So I'll have to figure out the event listener to figure that out. But that is a problem for another day. I am going to continue working on this off of the stream. So if you guys want to see like where the progress on this goes, you can actually probably find it on GitHub. I'll probably create a pull request for this in a little bit. So if you go to github.com, their repo for web.dev is in Google Chrome, web.dev. The issue that this is associated with is issue 2725. So if you want to follow that issue here in this add archive newsletter to newsletters, a pull request will probably show up here later on today. That's going to be marked or tagged to resolve this issue. So whenever I figure out what I'm doing here, this is the best place to go. Anyway, I thank you all for joining me for this 2-hour figuring out how to make newsletters work. But until next time, guys, have a great day. Bye.